27. My Amish family. Hid the burn mark on my shoulder for 25 years. My mother knew how it happened. The scar is still there. I don't need to look at it to know exactly where it sits. 3 inches below the curve of my right shoulder, shaped roughly like a flattened crescent, pale and smooth against the rest of my skin. For 25 years, I wore dresses with sleeves that covered it completely. I learned to angle my body away from mirrors. I learned to dress quickly and alone. And whenever anyone came close enough that it might have been seen, at a swimming hole in summer, during a medical examination, even the night of my wedding, someone in my family always seemed to appear, always seemed to redirect, always seemed to know exactly what needed to be prevented. I was 31 years old before I understood that the person managing all of those redirections was my mother. My name is Sarah. I grew up in a small Amish district in central Pennsylvania, the third of 6 children in a household that valued order above almost everything else. We were not cruel people, by any measure I knew at the time. My father was quiet and deliberate. My mother ran the house with the kind of efficiency that looked, from the outside, like devotion. She rose before anyone else. She kept the kitchen spotless. She knew where every object in our home belonged. And she knew, I understand now, exactly which truths belonged buried, and which ones could safely be spoken aloud. The burn happened when I was 5 years old. Or rather, that is when I was told it happened. A cooking accident, my mother said. I had wandered too close to the wood stove on a winter morning while she was occupied elsewhere, and the edge of a cast iron pan had caught my shoulder as it was lifted from the burner. A terrible accident, a moment's inattention. These things happen with young children underfoot. I believed that for 25 years. I believed it because I had no other information. I had no memory of the incident itself. I was 5, and whatever happened that morning left no recoverable image in my mind. Only the scar, and the story my mother told me to explain it. And the story was reasonable. Children do wander near stoves. Pans are heavy and unwieldy. Accidents leave marks. What I did not understand for a very long time was that a story doesn't need to be false to be incomplete. And an incomplete story, told consistently for decades by the people you trust most, functions in every practical way like a lie. I want to tell you about my mother first, because she is the person at the center of everything, and because understanding her is the only way the rest of this makes any sense. Miriam, that was her name, was the eldest daughter in her own family, raised by a father who served as a deacon in their district, and a mother who died of a lung illness when Miriam was 14. She had taken over the running of her father's household at 14, had cooked and cleaned and managed 4 younger siblings until she married my father at 19. By the time I was born, she had been managing things, silently, efficiently, without complaint, for her entire adult life. She was not a cold woman. That is what I need you to understand. She braided my hair with patience. She sat with me when I had fevers. She made sure I had the warmest quilt on the coldest nights. Her love was real, and I felt it. But her love came wrapped in something else. A constant, low-level vigilance that I mistook for attentiveness, and only recognized later as control. She was always watching. She was always calculating. And she was always managing what other people knew. My father, Jonas, deferred to her in nearly everything that happened inside the house. He was a good farmer, a respected man in our community, and he had the particular quality of a man who believes that peace inside a marriage is worth more than the temporary discomfort of asking a difficult question. He knew things. I believe now that he knew certain things, but he had a gift for not quite knowing them fully, for standing just far enough back from the edge of a truth that he could honestly say he had never looked over it. There were 6 of us children. My oldest brother, Eli, left the community when I was 12, and was not discussed after that. My sister Ruth, 4 years older than me, was the one who would eventually tell me the truth. And there was my younger brother Daniel, who knew less than any of us, but who, by some instinct I still cannot fully explain, always seemed to leave the room whenever the subject of my shoulder came up. I did not notice that pattern until I was well into adulthood. At the time, it simply seemed that Daniel was restless, the way young boys often are. The first moment that something felt wrong. Not wrong enough to name, but wrong enough to leave a small mark on my memory. Happened when I was 11 years old. A woman from the neighboring district had come to help my mother with canning. Her name was Hannah, and she was the kind of woman who said what she thought, without much filtering, which was unusual in our community, and which my mother clearly found exhausting. They were working over the stove while I passed jars between them, and I reached up to take a lid from a high shelf, and my sleeve slipped back from my shoulder, just enough to expose the edge of the scar. Hannah looked at it, not for long. A second, maybe two. Then she looked at my mother. My mother was already looking at her. It was the quality of that exchange that lodged itself in some quiet corner of my mind, and stayed there. It was not the look of two women who had both just noticed a child's old scar. It was the look of two people confirming, silently, that something seen had not been spoken. Hannah turned back to the stove. My mother moved me gently toward the door, and found something for me to do in another room. Nothing was said. I didn't think about it consciously for years afterward, but I kept it, the way you keep a small stone in a coat pocket, forgetting it's there until your hand finds it in the cold. By the time I was 16, my sister Ruth had become the person I trusted most in the world. She was 4 years older, sharp and perceptive, and privately skeptical of many things in our community that she would never have said aloud to our parents. We shared a room, and in the dark, after the lamp was out, we talked in the particular way that sisters do when they are old enough to have secrets, but young enough to believe sharing them is safe. I told her once about the canning incident, about the look between my mother and Hannah. I expected Ruth to dismiss it. Instead, she was quiet for a long time. "Don't ask Mama about your shoulder," she said finally. I asked her why. "Just don't," she said. "Some things in this house aren't meant to move." I didn't push her. Ruth had a way of closing a subject that made you understand, without hostility, that the door was shut. I filed the conversation away alongside the stone from the canning room, and moved on with my life. What I did not know until much later was that Ruth had known part of the truth since she was 17 years old. She had been told enough, not everything, but enough, by my mother, in a moment of controlled disclosure, to understand that the story of the cooking accident was not complete, and she had spent the following years protecting that partial knowledge, the way my mother had taught all of us to protect uncomfortable things, by learning not to look directly at them. I do not blame Ruth for that. I want to be clear about that now, because the rest of this will require me to be honest about the ways she failed me, and I want the failure and the love to exist in the same place, because that is where they actually lived. I married at 22. My husband, a decent and uncomplicated man named Aaron, knew about the scar only that it existed, and that it was old. I had told him what my mother told me: the stove, the pan, the winter morning. He accepted it without curiosity, the way he accepted most things that had happened before he was part of my life. On our wedding night, when he saw it for the first time in full, he touched it once, gently, and said nothing. I loved him for that. But weddings require the involvement of mothers, and in the weeks before mine, my mother had a conversation with me that I have thought about many times since. She came to my room in the early evening, 3 days before the ceremony. She sat on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap, a gesture I recognized as the one she used when she had something planned to say. "When you are married," she said, "you will build your own life, your own household, your own set of ways." She paused. "Some things that belong to our family stay in our family." I told her I understood. "Your shoulder," she said. "If anyone ever asks, you tell them what you know. The stove. You were 5. That's all there is." I looked at her. Is that not the truth? She held my gaze for exactly as long as it took to make the question feel answered, without being addressed. Then she smoothed her apron and stood. "It's all there needs to be," she said, and she left the room. I told myself, afterward, that this was simply my mother being private, that she was reminding me of our family's practice of not broadcasting personal matters, that the distinction she had drawn, between what was true and what needed to be told, was a reasonable one, the kind of distinction all families make about their histories. I told myself that for another 9 years. The person who finally changed everything was not my mother. It was not Ruth. It was not Hannah from the neighboring district, or any of the other women I had seen exchange careful glances over the years. When my shoulder came up in any form, it was my father's older brother, my Uncle Abner, who had left our district when I was very young, and who returned once, briefly, for my father's funeral when I was 31 years old. Abner was in his late 60s by then, and he had the particular quality of a man who had decided, at some point in his late life, that he had been careful for long enough. He sat beside me at the burial and said very little, but when the gathering afterward had thinned, and my mother was occupied in the kitchen, and Ruth was managing the children, he found me standing alone near the fence at the far edge of the yard. He looked at my shoulder, not at the scar which was covered, but at my shoulder specifically, as though he could see through the fabric. Then he looked at my face. "You should know," he said, "that your mother has carried something for a long time." I asked him what he meant. He was quiet for a moment. "Then who told you about the burn?" "My mother," I said. "The stove. I was 5. He nodded slowly. Not in agreement, in the way a person nods when they are deciding how much to say. "I was there that morning," he said. "The yard was completely silent, except for the wind moving through the fence grass. I felt the stone in my coat pocket, the one I had been carrying for 20 years, and I understood suddenly that it had always been waiting for this exact moment to become something heavier. It took me 3 more conversations to get the full truth. One with Abner, one with Ruth, and one, finally, with my mother herself. From Abner, I learned that he had been visiting our house that winter morning when the burn occurred, that he had been in the front room with my father, that what he remembered of that morning was not my mother near a stove, but my father's brother, a man named Caleb, my father's youngest brother, who had been staying with us for several weeks and who left our district shortly after my injury and was never spoken of in our household again. Caleb had been 23 that year. He had a history, Abner told me carefully, of a terrible temper. Not the kind of temper that announced itself loudly, but the quiet, sudden kind. The kind that moved fast, and left marks, and afterward required explanation. From Ruth, I learned that my mother had told her this much when Ruth was 17, that the burn had not come from a stove, that Caleb had been alone with me in the kitchen for a short time, that my mother had not been there when it happened, that by the time she understood what had occurred, my father had already spoken to Caleb privately, and the 2 brothers had reached some agreement about what would be said, and Caleb had left within a week, and the story of the cooking accident had already been decided. Ruth had kept this for 14 years because my mother had asked her to, because our father was still living then, because Caleb had eventually moved far away and was understood to be no longer a threat, because Ruth had been taught, as we all had been taught, that family survival sometimes required absorbing certain things quietly and continuing forward. She wept when she told me. Not performed weeping, the real kind, the kind that comes from a place that has been pressured for too long. She said she had wanted to tell me. She said she had told herself it was better I didn't know. She said she wasn't sure, anymore, which of those 2 things had been true. I held her hand. I didn't speak for a long time, and then I went to find my mother. Miriam was in the kitchen. Of course she was in the kitchen. She was always in the kitchen, cleaning dishes that had already been cleaned, which was what she did when she was anxious and needed to keep her hands occupied. I stood in the doorway. She had her back to me. I waited until she turned and saw me, because I wanted her to have a moment to decide whether she would manage this or meet it honestly. She looked at my face. She set down the cloth she was holding. "Ruth told you," she said. It was not a question. "Abner started it," I said. "Ruth finished it." She was quiet for a long time. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, and I sat across from her. And we faced each other, the way we had never quite faced each other in all my 31 years. She told me what I had not yet fully heard, that she had walked into the kitchen that morning to find me on the floor, crying, with Caleb standing over the stove, and that she had understood immediately from the shape and location of the burn. Too specific, too precise to have come from a child's accidental brush against a pan. What had happened? She told me that she had gone to my father that same evening and told him everything. She told me that my father had gone to Caleb, and that what had passed between them she never fully knew. She told me that my father had then come to her and told her what the story would be, and that they would not involve the bishop, and that Caleb would leave, and that it would be finished. Why? I asked. Not angrily. I was past angry by then. Or rather, the anger was there, but it was slow and deep, and it didn't need to be loud. Why did you agree to it? She folded her hands on the table. They were shaking slightly. Because I was afraid, she said, of what it would do to your father's name, to our standing, of what a bishop's inquiry would require you to go through at 5 years old, of what people would say about a family that couldn't protect their daughter in their own kitchen. She paused. I told myself we were protecting you. You were protecting the family, I said. She didn't disagree. I know, she said quietly. I have known that for 25 years. And I have never once stopped knowing it. Not for a single day. There was nothing triumphant in that moment. There was no relief in having finally been confirmed in what I had suspected, because suspecting is not the same as knowing, and knowing brought its own particular weight. I thought about the 11-year-old girl in the canning room, reaching up for a lid. I thought about Ruth at 17, receiving a truth too large for her age, and being asked to carry it forward indefinitely. I thought about my father, who had chosen the quiet management of a wrong over the difficult reckoning with it, and who was now in the ground, and could not be asked any questions at all. I thought about the scar on my shoulder, which had been with me every single day of my life, and which I had spent 25 years explaining with a story that was not mine, that had never been mine. It had been the story my parents built to preserve something, and they had given it to me to carry the way you give a child an object too heavy for her, and tell her it's a gift. I did not stop speaking to my mother after that. I want to be honest about that, because I think some people, when they hear a story like this, expect a clean severance, a door closed, a relationship ended, justice delivered in the form of permanent separation. That is not what happened. What happened was slower and more complicated. My mother was an old woman by then, widowed and diminished in the particular way that strong women become diminished when the structures they spent their lives managing are no longer needed. She had been carrying her share of this for 25 years too. That did not excuse what she had agreed to, but it was real, and I could see it in her face, and I was not willing to pretend otherwise simply because it would have been tidier. Ruth and I talked for many hours over many months. There were things I needed to say to her that were harder to say than what I had said to my mother, because I had trusted Ruth differently, not as a parent, but as an equal, as the person in my life who was supposed to be on my side without conditions. Working through that required more time than either of us expected. We are still working through it, honestly, but we are working through it together, which I have come to understand is a form of love, even when it is uncomfortable. The burn mark on my shoulder is still there. It does not hurt. It has not hurt in a very long time, but I am no longer in the habit of covering it, not because I want anyone to see it, but because covering it felt, once I understood its true history, like continuing to participate in a story that was never truthful. I wore long sleeves for 25 years, out of a habit that belonged to my mother, not to me. Letting my arms be what they are is one of the small, private ways I have reclaimed something that was never supposed to be taken. What I understand now, that I did not understand as a child or as a young woman, is that the silence my family built around that morning was never really about protecting me. It was about protecting the idea that we were a family, without serious fault. The kind of family that managed its troubles quietly, that maintained its reputation, that did not draw the bishop's attention, or the community's judgment. I was 5 years old. What happened to me was real, and it was wrong. And the people who loved me most made a decision to make it invisible, and then they handed me the invisibility and called it a finished matter. It was not finished. It was just hidden. There is a difference between a healed wound and a buried one. My family spent 25 years teaching me not to look at my shoulder. What they were really teaching me was not to look at the truth. And the two lessons ran so close together for so long that for years I could not tell them apart. My mother gave me many things I am genuinely grateful for. Her hands in my hair, her quilt, her patience on feverish nights. I carry all of those things too, and I do not intend to put them down. But I am done carrying the story she built for me in that kitchen 25 years ago. Standing over a 5-year-old girl on the floor, calculating what could be said, and what needed to remain invisible. That story was hers. It was never mine to keep.